All right, well, I guess just to respect everybody's time, Matt and Jim, I think we can go ahead and start. I'll just introduce our two new speakers to everybody out there. So Jim Horan is the Executive Director and Matt Straub is the Senior Program Officer at LISC, the Northland Industry Support Corporation in Connecticut. Matt is Senior Program Officer for Lending and Investments. They'll provide a quick update of aspects of the state housing and community development in Connecticut. Among the topics they're going to be going over are the impact of interest rates. Yikes. That's an aside, technical aside. Federal funding, pre-development resources, yay. Technical assistance, supply chain issues, and everything else and the labor market on achieving neighborhood transformation and housing opportunities. Particularly pre-development has always been an interest of ours. They will discuss LISC's role nationally and through the LISC Connecticut as a nonprofit intermediary to support the development of sustainable, equitable, and healthy communities. So terrific. Welcome, Jim and Matt. I don't know who wants to start.
Yeah, I'm going to start, and I'm going to give you sort of a broad overview about LISC and LISC Connecticut, and then Matt's going to get into more specifics around lending and some of the other topics that you just covered, Dean. So
okay, and if I could ask everybody in the audience to mute themselves, while the presentation is going on. I will do the same in just a second. And then if you have a question, just raise your hand because I'm watching the participant list, or if you have something you want to put in the chat, I'm trying to track that as well. I'm not as competent at it as people younger than I am, but I'm trying to do it. So, and if you guys are okay with it, if it makes sense, I'll ask if you can be interrupted and answer a question rather than save them all to the end. Okay.
Yeah, no, we're happy to be interrupted, make it more interactive if people have questions as we go. So
perfect. Okay.
So
take it away.
All right, Matt. Yep, there we go. So who is LISC? So LISC is the Local Initiative Support Corporation. We're the nation's largest community development support organization and CDFI, Community Development Financial Institution. We are from LISC Connecticut, which is one of 38 local program offices around the country. Many of them are for single cities or metropolitan areas, but LISC Connecticut operates statewide. We also have a rural program that operates in all 50 states and many counties across the country. Since 1979, when LISC was founded by the Ford Foundation, we've invested over $24 billion in historically disinvested places with a focus on affordable housing, but also other physical development and including community centers, charter schools, recreation centers, and more. We also have a network of financial opportunity centers that we'll talk a little bit more about in the context of Connecticut. Since LISC Connecticut started in 1984, we've invested $94 million throughout the state. So in addition to that $94 million investment, that has leveraged $828 million in additional funding. We've helped to build almost 5,000 affordable homes and apartments, plus almost 400,000 square feet of retail and community space, and 21 childcare centers serving over 2,900 children. We're hoping to revive that program, which is not operating right now, soon. And we have this network of financial opportunity centers, and it says 6, but we're actually up to 7 now with one that we added in the past month. Some of the recent investments that we've made include one to Mutual Housing Association of Greater Hartford to acquire properties in the Frog Hollow neighborhood, in Essex with Hope Partnership, an $800,000 acquisition loan for the lofts at Spencer's Corner, which is 17 affordable units in a mixed-use rental project. They're above commercial space that was underutilized. And then recently we made a $70,000 grant to Concorp in New Haven, which is for a childcare facility that's going to be part of a major mixed-use portfolio, mixed-use property on Dixwell Avenue in New Haven. We're really excited about that development. Next slide. So won't cover everything on here, but just to say that we do a lot of work to empower people, transform places experiencing distress and underinvestment. We support enterprises, drive systems change, and leverage investments, and a little more specifically about how we do it. So we invest in people and communities that are underinvested and marginalized, including with loans and grants to those communities. We try to build organizational and ecosystem capacity, especially with community development corporations. They're a major focus of our work. In the last couple of years, we've also been trying to work with neighborhood revitalization zones, starting in Hartford, but we're hoping to do this work statewide because we think that's really key to having the voice of the community involved in community development. We advise residents, organizations, and investors as part of our work. We also convene resources and stakeholders. So a couple of examples of that, we have the Hartford Neighborhood Development Support Collaborative that's been operating for over 25 years and provides annual operating support to several community development corporations in Hartford. We also, through the Hartford Neighborhood Development Support Collaborative, bring people together in Hartford to talk about development issues and what's going on in neighborhoods. And we also do some advocacy work, primarily as a partner with other groups, like working with the Partnership for Strong Communities and its Home Connecticut initiative. Also have been involved with Desegregate CT in the past couple of years, and the Open Communities Alliance, looking to try to change zoning and create more equitable zoning to be able to build more affordable housing, especially in suburban communities. So since 1984, we've helped to develop over 4,800 homes. A lot of that is multifamily rental, but also home ownership housing. And we've had a program called Housing Connections that was funded by CHFA for many years that has helped to build over 600 units of affordable housing in suburban and rural communities. Of the $94 million invested, $68 million of that is in lending, $13 million is in capacity building grants, including HUD Section 4 grants that go to community development corporations to help support their capacity, and then another $13 million through that Hartford Neighborhood Development Support Collaborative with direct funding for operating support to CDCs. So one program that we've gotten underway in the past couple of years in Connecticut, but has been operating for more than 15 years nationally, are financial opportunity centers. And these are career and financial coaching service centers that work through local nonprofit agencies to help people with low to moderate incomes to become more financially stable. There's a network of 130 of the financial opportunity centers around the country. It's based on a model that we developed with the Annie E. Casey Foundation. And the core services of these financial opportunity centers are one-on-one financial coaching, employment services, and income supports. And the kind of magic of the FOCs is that we integrate or bundle these services in a way that has greater impact than if somebody's receiving any one of these services by themselves. And the FOC partner sites that we have around the state, 2 in Hartford at the Urban League and the Village for Families and Children, 1 in New Britain at HRA, also working with the Community Action Agency of New Haven, Open Door Shelter, which is in Norwalk, Naugatuck Valley Community College in Waterbury, and Person to Person, which is our new site started last month in Darien, but to serve Stanford residents. And then we also have a Housing and Community Development Leadership Institute that was that's funded by the Department of Housing and CHFA. This was started a couple of years ago, and we just took it over less than a year ago. It's focused on bringing women of color into the housing and community development field. We have a cohort of 16 participants right now and are starting to recruit for the next cohort. And the HCDLI provides educational workshops and internships for people who are already working, but usually in other fields and want to get involved with housing and community development. And at the end of a 12-month period, individuals should be ready to transition into careers with certificates that we award through the program. And I saw that there were a couple of questions that came in on the chat about retrofitting, and I'll leave that to Matt, who's going to talk about some more specifics of our programs to get into.
Good. So, in addition to all of that programming that LISC had just described, LISC's core activity is as a community development finance institution, or CDFI. So we work with both nonprofit and for-profit developers of affordable housing, as well as community and economic development projects. And then through national affiliates, we also offer small business and charter school lending. So we really kind of cover a lot of different needs throughout the community development cycle. We provide both secured and unsecured pre-development financing, as well as acquisition, construction, and occasionally perm lending, though not always is that kind of the most competitive way for us to be involved in a project. We generally approach our lending as a relationship lender. So, what we're doing is underwriting not only the project, but the organization to ensure that we're really setting up projects and organizations for long-term success. So we really see underwriting as kind of a collaborative process, more so than just an opportunity for me to read a lot of documentation. We evaluate all of our projects through an internally developed impact matrix, through which we try to evaluate our impact on communities by looking at not only how the project will impact the community, but how the loan is potentially helping to advance and build the capacity of underserved developers, as well as the green components of any project. So we do evaluate projects' kind of green development credentials, though we don't have any specific requirements for green elements of a project, for a couple of reasons. And I think that's in part because those are typically put in place by permanent funders. So we don't see it as our place as an early stage lender to put those requirements into place, because ultimately it makes compliance a lot more complex when you've got additional funders to report to. And then ultimately it also adds a lot of complexity and work on our end to be able to monitor those things. So what we try and do is ultimately make things easy and rely where we can on permanent funders and their requirements. We do have energy retrofit funding available, though we typically defer to the Connecticut Green Bank, which we think is really great for that kind of product. LISC receives its loan funds from a number of sources. So LISC is S&P rated, and we do have access to the bond market, which is one of the ways we secure loan capital, in addition to at the national level through CRA motivated financial institutions. Locally, we're able to secure lower cost capital, so we can pass on that savings to borrowers, which is particularly useful in the current interest rate environment. Or we can secure grant capital, which we can re-lend, which allows us to either make loans that would be too risky to make using fully recourse capital, or we can use it to go beyond appraised value in certain instances. So we do have our TOD loan fund, through which we can make loans up to 120% loan to value for projects that are within half a mile of CT Fast Track, CT Transit if it offers 7-day service, Hartford Line or Metro North. We also were one of 22 projects or 22 initiatives that was just voted on by the SIF 2030 board. That'll be in front of the bond commission at the beginning of December for us to secure additional first loss capital for any project in one of the 57 communities defined by the SIF 2030 Act. So that would again allow us to go above appraised value for acquisition on targeted parcels in those communities. We also have a $5 million loan fund that we secured from Trinity Health of New England for projects in Greater Hartford, Greater Waterbury, and Greater Stafford Springs. That's money that we can put out at 4%, which, in this environment is, I think, very competitive. So in addition to other opportunities that we have available through national LISC to advance other kind of targeted priorities. So, these are the kinds of things that we're able to offer and that we can kind of piece together in different ways with individual borrowers to make things work. So, as I said, we really offer kind of the whole gamut of kind of loan products. We do offer acquisition lines of credit, and in some cases working capital lines of credit. There's kinds of different ways that loans can be structured. Ultimately, one of our attorneys once described LISC as offering boutique financial solutions, and I think that's kind of a really fun way to look at it. So this is something I didn't want to get too deeply into. So LISC offers typically fixed rate loan options, and our loan rates currently reset quarterly. So this is kind of current, and just to have this here, and we can certainly send out updated ones as that information becomes available. So, I think one of the things that we were asked to talk about today was the interest rate environment. So, this is something that we're seeing a lot of developers struggling with, given the long time frame for development in Connecticut, right? So looking at 9% projects, they submitted their applications last fall. And now as they're working towards closing, we've seen the Federal Reserve increase interest rates 5 times. And by all accounts, they're not done yet. So that blows holes in project budgets. As everyone knows, affordable housing projects are structured to minimize the amount of subsidy required and to really maximize the use of other sources. So particularly for debt financed projects or those that have a large debt component, we're seeing deals struggle with new holes because they're really capped with the amount of debt service that they can cover. So I just, for comparison's sake, pulled CHFA quoted rates. 11.4 was the closest to 1 year ago that the Wayback Machine had available on the internet. But interest rates for 40-year fully amortizing loans have increased almost 3% in that time. So what this means is that if you're capped at what you can support for debt service, that you can support more than $600,000 less on a $2 million loan. So another way to look at that is your supportable debt service is about 70% of what it was a year ago. So for any, if you're looking at a larger loan as part of your capital stack, then you have an even larger gap. And the ways to address this are either through value engineering, through additional subsidy, or some combination of the two. I don't think there's a lot of ability to raise rents or to lower operating costs. And this is the position that a lot of developers are finding themselves in right now. And we're seeing a very similar dynamic play out on the homeownership side. So for those of you that are developing homeownership projects, home buyers are seeing a very similar situation as far as mortgage rates. So these are governmentally insured. So FHA mortgage interest rates through the CHFA first-time homebuyer program. So what we're looking at here is rate increases of almost 4% increase, and this kind of just worked out kind of interestingly that it was an exactly $500 monthly payment increase just based on that interest rate increase alone. So that's not even addressing changes in the market itself as far as price increases in homes. But what that means is that you need to have an additional $20,000 in annual income to afford a house at the same price over 1 year ago. So in addition to all of those potential increases in construction costs, home buying or single family home developers who are looking to target low and moderate income buyers are potentially getting pinched on the other side if they also need to ensure that their homes are affordable to a wide enough group of buyers. And then the construction cost environment, again, what we're seeing, and based on this report by CBRE, is that construction costs are projected to increase 14% in 2022 before hopefully stabilizing in early to middle 2023. In addition to those construction cost increases, we're still seeing lots of issues with supply chain management. And this is, in part, there's a number of reasons, including the war in Ukraine and Russian sanctions. We're still seeing issues with trucking and labor costs. And this is particularly acute in historic renovations where there's fewer opportunities to be able to make substitutions. If there's only one window spec that's appropriate, then you're really stuck with that window spec. And, we're hearing, from some developers, quoted delivery times of 20 weeks or higher on windows, which really limits your ability to do anything else in that building, right? You can't start, building out a kitchen if you don't have windows in place. So it really kind of puts projects at a standstill, which, increases time, increases risk, and ultimately increases cost. So, this is our contact information. Feel free to reach out, if you want, discuss lending, discuss, just your project. We see ourselves as a partner. We provide technical assistance free of cost to individual developers, with the idea that we see ourselves as ultimately trying to advance the work of the field. So I apologize, I haven't been monitoring the chat, so I don't know what questions people have.
Yeah, I can, this is Dean, Matt. I can jump in and talk about that a little bit. The first, I guess the first question goes to you, Matt, and that is, and the good news is, question mark?
There has been, I think, federal subsidy, I think, has been really critical to filling some of these gaps, for, all of the big things that I think we hoped for from ARPA. A lot of that is just going towards hopefully filling gaps, right? I think the state of Connecticut, between that and SIF 2030, I think is going to be another great source for that. The state has really committed resources to advancing critical projects, and I think that that's kind of going to be of great utility relative to maybe some other states where there's not the same level of commitment to investment.
Yeah. Okay. So a couple of questions came in. I think they've been answered. A couple of them have been anyway. But Steve Hall, you had a question in the chat, and I think you have a question now, so go ahead.
Yes, I'd like to address, obviously I understand what you guys are doing here on the financial side, but energy efficiency measures can have incredible impact on easing the financial burdens here. I don't know if you know that Eversource offers up to $4.50 a square foot for energy efficient buildings. And I can think of nothing more important, or almost no important, than reducing the energy cost to almost zero for the tenants. And on commercial ventures, these guys are struggling with these interest rates. If they could, say, 100,000 square foot project, if they can get $450,000 in incentives, that's not insignificant. So that's where I'm saying that. And by the way, I think early on, I think, Jim, you mentioned you guys don't get involved, appropriate time at the front end to be able to impose or ask for energy efficiency measures. Eversource offers an appraisal program for energy efficiency up to 90% complete drawings. So that's pretty far down the road in project development. So I just want to make these points that energy efficiency can have significant financial bearing on what you guys are doing.
Steve, that's definitely correct. And the projects that we're working on, so generally affordable housing projects, are already taking that into account and are already availing themselves of those funds. These are changes that are happening beyond that, right? That Eversource's energy efficiency dollars are already included in project capital stacks typically. And the goal is already to do that. So this is creating an additional gap beyond the Eversource capital.
Oh, well, I'm really glad to hear that. Absolutely, these guys are nuts. I keep going to developers here in my section of the woods here in Greenwich, Connecticut, say, hey guys, how would you like to get some incentives just on the commercial, real estate development? And nobody answers. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, it's, when LISC is, generally working with, while we do work with for-profit developers. We are primarily working with nonprofit developers.
Right.
And those developers are really aware of those sources already. And when we're looking at rental housing in particular, these deals are structured with 6 or 7 sources of permanent capital. One of which is the Eversource capital, which is so fantastic because it comes in as a grant. So that's something that all of those developers are typically already aware of.
Good.
Terrific. Okay. Thanks, Steve. Kathy, you have a question or two?
Of course, I will remember to unmute, which you would think after 2 years I'd learned to do, but still doesn't happen all the time. So in Connecticut, when we talk about community development, we often talk about projects, right? And when I work in other states, we often talk about programs that are rehab programs or, all sorts of things like that. And I'm curious, I know that both Matt and Jim, you've done a lot of, looking at other states and other programs. And as we go forward, are there ways to think about that good news that the Dean's looking for in how we might up production?
Ooh, that's a tough question, that there's, and again, I think a lot of it comes down to the commitment of resources, right? Like that's the development of affordable housing in Connecticut requires a substantial amount of subsidy, and there's a number of reasons for that. The act of construction here is relatively high, that in New England, construction costs are high. We don't typically see the same levels of return as Boston and New York, neither of which are particularly far away. Land costs are high. There's a lot of regulatory barriers at the municipal level, which again add both time and cost, particularly legal costs. So the commitment of resources that the state has made, I think really is, we need to see those kinds of long-term commitments because there's always kind of a push to innovate, right? And we can innovate ourselves out of this problem. And that's kind of difficult because it's putting the burden of innovation onto others rather than acknowledging that there is a need for additional resources and additional capital if we want to see additional production, right? That's ultimately kind of, I think, what it boils down to. It's innovation is not enough to be able to make that kind of meaningful change.
Yeah, if I could add, I agree with Matt, of course, and I would say that the commitment of resources that the state is making with the Community Investment Fund 2030, which is up to $175 million in bond funds a year for 5 years and at least for 5 years and possibly for 10 years. That's really significant and I think could make a big difference. We're pretty pleased with the initial list of awardees from the SIF 2030. It included a number of projects that we are working with or have spoken with. So that is encouraging. And there was also huge demand. I mean, I think there was $650 to $750 million in applications for the first round of funding of $75 million. So I think there's, awareness of this and that can help generate more development. Another big area, as Matt said, is regulatory. And I mentioned that we've been working with Desegregate CT and Home Connecticut and others to improve or create a better environment for the construction of affordable housing, especially in suburban communities. And the requirement, the statutory requirement that towns have affordable housing plans. I saw recently that 65% of towns did submit affordable housing plans on time, and most other towns that did not do it on time with DOH said that they're in process. We'll see how good those plans really are. I saw ratings down in Fairfield County that I think it was the Fairfield County Center for Housing Opportunity, or RPA, did, and they There were a lot of, D's in there, not very good, but there's some good ones as well. I think Stanford in particular was highly rated, and Westport I think came in pretty high too. There's the requirement, the ADU requirement, but it also allowed for opt-out, which was disappointing. And I think that a number of municipalities that need more affordable housing are opting out. So that's disappointing. There's also some municipal efforts apart from the affordable housing plans. We're starting to talk to Hartford about a home ownership initiative in the city. Stanford's been doing things for years, New Haven as well, with an inclusionary zoning ordinance. So I think all of those can help to increase the supply, and that's obviously very much needed, as demonstrated by the shortfall that we have, that COVID has only made worse in the last few years.
Yeah. Thanks. Kathy, did you have anything else?
No, that's really helpful. And it really, and I'm particularly glad to hear about the work in Hartford and the home ownership rehab, as I'm sure Logan is. And you probably already knew about it. So are there things, I think we all see how much deteriorated housing there is in the state, and how hard it is to address that with tax credits. And what you're talking about is exactly what I think needs to happen. And I think we in this group tend to focus again on new construction, which, has all its own environmental risks, right? Or, impacts or whatever. And so I'm interested in, what kind of thinking can and should we be doing about those issues?
Are you talking about looking at rehabs as well as new construction? Is that? Yeah. So Matt, I think you'd.
Yeah, I mean, I think Kathy, when you and I had spoke, we were talking about, building life cycle emissions, right? And truly the most efficient thing to do is to renovate a building, not to build a new one. There's, I think, a lot of good opportunities for rehabbing and retrofitting older buildings. The historic homes rehabilitation tax credit is really useful in that way, in that it provides, I think, 30% of allowable costs up to $20,000 or to $30,000 per unit in a building. So it's for buildings of up to 3 or 4 units. Right now, I believe that those credits are only available to nonprofits or to existing homeowners. So the nonprofits, if they're looking to resell a property for owner occupancy. But I think there's an opportunity there to potentially expand that credit to the use of a wider range of developers, because that's the kind of credit that I think is really of great utility to historic homes. Those are noted to have higher rehab costs because of their historic nature, right? That you've got potential lead paint or asbestos, you've got to deal with lath and plaster construction and brownstone foundations and all of the things that come with that. But the opportunity there, I think, is so high.
Yeah, and I'm forgetting, Matt, but there's also the legislation at the federal level that would create something like the low-income housing tax credit for homes, historic homes in across the country, but it would be especially useful in Connecticut municipalities. And Carrie Shea from Hartford is one of the national leaders in trying to push that legislation, and LISC is one of many organizations looking to get that passed, and a number of members of our delegation from Connecticut are on board. So we'll see if that goes through. But Matt, do you recall the name of that? It's the national.
The name is escaping me, but yeah. I know the program you're referring to. We can certainly send that out in the chat at some point.
Logan had a couple of questions and comments in the chat. One is about energy efficiency funds to renovate historic buildings, and that Hartford's really dogmatic about the windows and insulation that can be installed, and whether other communities in the state are more flexible. I don't know, Matt, if you're aware.
No, I don't. So some of that I think it's not just the Hartford Historic Commission, but it's also SHPO. So, you know, at the State Historic Preservation Office, if you're using the those kinds of funds for historic renovations, that's really where the windows requirements come from. And, you know, the historic windows really are, I think, a really big barrier. And I do know, I think Logan Dean and I were actually talking about this, that I think there is a fiberglass window product that potentially can be approved by historic, though I don't know whether that's actually happened yet. But I don't think that's unique to Hartford. I think that's statewide.
Yeah.
I would be curious, because I was having this conversation today, and just sort of, is this federal protocol that is tying the hands of SHPO, or is it completely discretionary? Because it does seem like, as we're talking about energy efficiency, lowering the cost for owners, and thinking about our changing climate, that, I mean, if it's not the Mark Twain house, I mean, and the window pretty much looks exactly the same, why not have a more affordable window that's going to be energy efficient, help the homeowner, and you're still retaining the historic character by not demolishing it, and make sure that everything on the exterior looks good. The other thing is the interior. You can't use the updated insulation on the inside, because that's considered and I guess a unreversible action. Like, and that to me is just sort of like head scratching. It's inside a building, it's insulation, you can't see it, and it's going to be helping in the future. It's just that I don't understand that one.
That is I hadn't heard that one. I assumed that it was mostly blown in insulation that was happening. Is the idea that you would be going, so what insulation is it that you're not getting approval to use?
So I will have to ask Dean for the specifics, but I know that is just one of the many things that adds to his stress levels when managing these properties, and it just seems nonsensical. Like,
Actually, we've had a couple of really interesting conversations with this group, with SHPO, and members trying to understand a little better the rules. I've worked on more than 200 federal tax credit applications, so I'll have a little overview from there. But one of the things is that each project is different. You know, in other words, the federal regulations that apply to the use of federal money and the state regulations that are applied to the state tax credits require looking at each building and the circumstances of that building and how a particular element goes into the overall reason that building is on the register, but they absolutely always include the interior. But we were able to look at some of the moisture issues as a conversation with that group. And Paul Selnow, who sends his regret, he's at a Passive House conference today, and is usually with us, was able to provide some analysis, specific and coming from the direction that, you're asking for a credit, or you're asking, for use of federal funds, that you have to base it on the historic nature of the building. And so we had a great conversation with SHPO about that. And, in a particular project, he was able to point out the value of the specific insulation strategy based on the conversations we had at this group. We also had a great presentation by APT, the Association of Preservation Technology, and they have a standing committee on preservation and climate, where they're working very hard to pull out examples of strategies that have been used in different circumstances and addressing issues. So there's a complicated set of really interesting conversations about this going on. But, it's within a framework that, again, if you're using federal funds that come from the federal level and SHPO is implementing them, but they really have to answer that. And if they don't comply with that, they'll get overturned. And that's happened at least once in the state, where the state approved something and the federal said, no, that's too liberal. So it is a broad conversation. Actually, in New York, they have a particular person at the State Historic Preservation Office assigned to affordable housing, because of, the different building types and the issues like that, who's been able to work on those issues again, but it's always going to be a building by building decision. They're never going to approve a window to use on historic buildings. It's going to always be from the viewpoint of the history of that building.
I think that we like Kathy said, over the years, we've had several different sort of runs at SHPO and historic preservation, those kinds of things. And that's exactly what seems to be emerging. It's like, it takes a lot of time to negotiate. It's a conversation and it's a negotiation too on a specific project, right? And so, but understanding the framework that within which SHPO is allowed to do things and beyond which they can't is critical to that conversation. And then, they seem to be of goodwill, but they've got a box around them to a certain extent. That box might be loosened up by a whole different level of effort, but for right now, it seems that understanding how that box works and why it is what it is helps with an individual sort of, not exactly an exception, but sort of a stretch. And so better things can happen. Yeah, it's too bad Paul's not on here because he's had that experience as well. Yeah, terrific. Yeah, Logan, you had something in here also about desegregate Connecticut. Has that been answered for you?
Oh yeah, basically with a comment. So this came up with the Home Connecticut Coalition, but the gentleman from desegregate Connecticut said with the ADU legislation that a lot of towns were opting out. Some towns were opting out publicly because they didn't like being, pegged into that language. But then the actual municipality was drafting up their own protocol. So while on the surface, it's a no, we're not doing it. Don't worry, people, we're not getting into ADUs. On your own policies, you can actually create it and you're not being forced to do it, but you're doing it on your own volition. And so politically you're safe, but you still are going in that direction. So it wasn't clear to me, did that just happen in one town and this is just anecdotal, or is there more than that? Certainly there are plenty of people that opted out that are not going to do that. But the point is that Desegregate Connecticut is investigating that, looking into it, and will report out of what has actually happened in practice with people's different policies internally.
So other questions from the group? Talking about ADUs, is LISC involved with any ADU projects anywhere in the state?
No, I don't think we have any. There are not. I mean, because they're often individuals, and we usually work with larger scale projects. On a policy level, we supported desegregate CT to get the ADU legislation passed. And I know we participate in the Fairfield County Center for Housing Opportunity and Fairfield County Housing Alliance, and they're really hopeful that the ADU legislation can have an impact. And so, we'll continue to work with them to see, kind of like what Logan is saying, those towns that might have opted out of the state legislation, to see whether they actually adopt regulations locally. In the Hartford area, I know Glastonbury is doing that, but I don't yet know whether they're doing it in a way that's meaningful and helpful, or whether they're doing it just to protect themselves legally, and whether it's not really going to lead to new construction. Because around the country, it's a mixed bag. Like in California, the legalization of ADUs, or the requirement that municipalities allow ADUs, has resulted in a lot of new construction. I don't yet know if there's been an analysis of whether that's increased much affordability or not, which is part of what we at LISC would want to see. But the increase in new units is important in a place like California and many places around the country that have a shortfall of any type of housing. But then in other places, ADU ordinances have not had all that much impact. So, I think the jury's still out. But there are advocacy groups like Desegregate CT and the Fairfield County Center for Housing Opportunity that are going to be following this to see what the impact might be.
Yeah, I work in Jersey, and they historically, back in the, I guess, 80s, 90s, they were very progressive on ADUs, and then sort of dissipated, and they never quite came back. I think they might be starting again. And I live in Norwalk, and they're doing that exception, and wait and see kind of.
Yeah.
How is our alternative really going to be consistent with actually complying?
Yeah, I mean, just talking about New Jersey makes me think about we also work with the Open Communities Alliance, which is pushing for fair share housing legislation like New Jersey has through the Mount Laurel court cases, where they require every municipality to have its fair share of affordable housing in the state. And I know right now 8-30G, of course, is very controversial and not nearly as intrusive, if you will, on local zoning regulations as is the Mount Laurel legislation in New Jersey. So we'll see where all of this goes, but I think it requires legislative solutions, litigation sometimes, and activity at the local level, all combined to make things happen.
Terrific. Yeah.
Yeah, there definitely is a financing issue with ADUs. It's part of what the National Housed campaign is trying to look at, because it's very hard for people who can't pay cash to finance the construction of an ADU. And then it's really hard to get new buyers to be able to, to afford the ADU the way the calculations are done. For FHA, it used to be different, that made it work better for multifamily properties. And that's a big problem for a lot of financing of our, 2 and 3 family homes, because, basically the rent is added to the income, and then only like a third of that rental income is applied to your mortgage, and very few people can afford that. So it's an issue. But switching gears here a little bit. So we've had a lot of questions here about how LISC fits into the energy world that a lot of the people on the call live in. And some of those conversations that used to take place with the Connecticut Housing Coalition, which had a big role in the peer-to-peer network previously, don't have the same connections for our network. And I'm wondering if Jim and Matt, you could give some advice about how without it being our full-time job like it is yours, folks could better connect to some of the, the things that you've told us about.
Well, I mean, Matt said, if you want to get on our email list, that's one thing that we can do. There's the upcoming Partnership for Strong Communities Connecticut Affordable Housing Conference, which I think is a really great venue, and the Partnership for Strong Communities has done an excellent job with that. But it's also certainly true that in the absence of the Housing Coalition, there are certain things, communications and convenings that are not happening. And, we are looking at how we as LISC can play more of a convening role, and when it's appropriate to do so. We have the Connecticut Vibrant Communities Coalition that brings together mostly municipal officials around blight issues. The Hartford Neighborhood Development Support Collaborative that I mentioned that brings together advocates and providers of affordable housing and community development in Hartford, but looking to see what else we can do to fill some of the gaps created by the loss of the housing coalition.
Did you have something more, Kathy?
Yeah, it was exciting also to get the update on the training program, which I've just recently started running into people from that program. I don't know if that's because we're out and about more, or that people are finishing the program. It's really exciting. I wonder, I'm curious, is energy efficiency part of the program in that training? Is that something we could collaborate on?
Yeah, I'm not sure that it is, but we are developing the curriculum and looking for instructors and lecturers as part of that. So we could certainly talk more about that.
Great.
I think the other thing that, this group may be able to help with are potential internship locations. That's something that I know Casey has been working on quite a bit, is placement of interns from the program. So, if there's an opportunity at your organization, if she hasn't already spoken with you, that there's an opportunity to potentially house some of these learners at your organization.
Who is the training program is targeted at? Is it a workforce development effort, or?
Yes, it's a
development groups.
It's a workforce development effort, and it's on a pretty small scale. We have a cohort of 16, mostly women in the first round, and we have another cohort that we're beginning to recruit for. And the idea is to bring women, especially women of color, into the field. Of the 16 participants that we have now, I think 15 are women, and I think 15 are people of color. So, that's the target audience. And the idea is to have one or possibly more than one cohort a year of about 20 people to bring them into the field. And then Logan just asked a question about the interns and how they're paid. They are paid by the organization that hires them. But this past year, we had a pretty significant subsidy for that. And depending on the availability of funding, we would provide some level of subsidy to the organizations that hire the interns.
And these are people being trained in the mechanics of delivering affordable community development, organization staffs. Is that
right? There's 3 tracks. One is on affordable housing management, another is affordable housing development, and the third is on residential services, I believe.
Cool.
Matt, that's correct, right?
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I was going to ask, we're getting close to time.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
If I could just, Logan had one other question there that I can quickly answer. It can be for people who are in the field at a lower level, as well as people coming into the field, Logan. So either. Yeah. Sorry about that.
Oh, terrific. That's what I was telling you. I don't keep up with the chat.
No, I'm just trying to keep. I'm trying.
You were actually talking, and you kept up with the chat. Don't count on me, guys. But I did have one last question for you about the peer-to-peer. So we do this every month in principle, and we find people to talk about things every month. And we record it and put it online. And I was wondering if maybe you can think about this a little bit. If you could think of a topic or because our group is affordable housing developers, architects, energy consultants, managers, property managers. If there was something where we could do one of these that would be somehow a benefit to your target constituents, say community development organizations, I think, I don't think anybody on the group would mind if we set up something like that to do one of our peer-to-peers or more than one on topics that could help you in either capacity building or in spreading what you're doing. And so it could be, a lot of what we do is how certain things get done in buildings. It's sometimes very technical. How did you do this? What reaction did you have? How did you actually get it past whoever you had to get it past to get it done? But it's sort of, it's ground truth stuff a lot of the time. And so if there are issues that come up that you'd like to see sort of unpacked a little bit in a webinar like this, I think we'd be willing to try and figure out how to do that. Right, Kathy and everybody? I think that would be something that the peer-to-peer would be happy to help you with.
Yeah, that sounds great. So we'll think about that. And we have a relationship with Kathy on something else. And Kathy asked about the HCDLI, the Housing Community Development Leadership Institute. So yeah, let's have some further conversations about that. We'd love to have to work more together.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you all for coming. Just a bit of advice to Jim. Typically, if you have an animal in your video, it eats up all the scenery. And we try to pay attention to you, but we can't.
He's got a lot of play today. This is the second time today he's been mentioned. My daughter will be very happy to hear this. She always wants reports of anybody noticing the dog. So that's Bo.
So anyhow, any other comments from anybody in the group? I think we're basically at time. Vicky, can you remind me, have we got somebody set up for November? I think we do.
It's actually going to be December 2nd. It's going.
Oh, that we're pushing it first of December.
Nandini, yes, Nandini from Chaffa.
And who?
Nandini from Chaffa.
Oh, yeah, from Chaffa. Okay. Okay, good enough. So you guys are on our list now, so we'll keep you posted of what we're doing. And like I said, if you think of something that it might be interesting for us to do something on and get the perspective of our group into something that might become an accessible webinar that then your constituents could actually access, we'd be happy to try to do that.
That would be great. Thanks a lot. Thanks for the opportunity. We appreciate Kathy
right.
reaching out to us. So
Well, terrific, everybody. I want to know what the dog is looking at. Okay, never mind. But everybody have good weekends. Sort of can't miss, I don't think, today and tomorrow. So have good ones. Thank you, guys.
Take care.
Thanks, Jim and Matt.